Hello, everybody. Welcome to this lesson, this pre-recorded lesson of the leaders of World War II. This is an introduction to World War II and the leaders who are involved. This is going to build off of yesterday's activity where you guys learned a little bit about each of these leaders. Now, this is not a real picture. This is a wax museum of the different leaders of World War II. These seven were never in the same room. So we will move forward. All right, so a couple key terms for today. Number one, fascism is a far right-wing political movement. It includes nationalism, violence against their enemies, government headed by a dictator. We've talked about some people who are fascists already. Nazi Germany, otherwise in this PowerPoint, NG, is Germany under control of the National Socialist Party, aka the Third Reich. Now, the First Reich would be the Holy Roman Empire. The Second Reich would be who? Be under Otto von Bismarck. Except the Revolutionary Right or the radical nationalists in Japan. They were hostile to parliamentary documentaries and dedicated to the emperor and expansion of the powers of the emperor and Japan. Number four, appeasement, the act of giving in to avoid confrontation. And lastly, the German-Soviet Non-Aggression Pact signed in 1913, also called the Molotov-Ribbentrop Pact, which ensured neutrality between Nazi Germany and the Soviet Union. So, getting started with our first box. Benito Mussolini, leader of Italy. He was a former soldier and socialist. He used his own private army called the Black Shirts to overthrow the government in 1922. He was the complete opposite of Marxian socialism, which is just a fancy way of saying basically communism. He thought expansion, war, and empire building were essential to the power and growth of a country. He also believed in centralized power of the state, meaning that all the power of the state was localized. It was in one area, one department, one person. So he would be considered a dictator. He signed the Lateran Accords in 1929, which made the Vatican a sovereign state. When we talked about the unification of Italy, I talked to you guys about how Mussolini was really the only one to fully unify Italy because the Pope was angry. The Pope did not like, basically, a unified Italy because it meant that people would not be listening to him. It meant that he had no power. So, when Mussolini made the Vatican a sovereign state and gave the Pope political power, everybody was happy. In 1935, he invaded Ethiopia, and in 1936, he created the Rome-Berlin Axis, creating a treaty between himself and Nazi Germany. He also created the Pact of Steel in 1939. These are alliances between Nazi Germany and Italy. He also had a fascination with super soldiers. And yes, I do kind of mean Captain America super soldiers. He tried to splice, not himself personally, but he had scientists try and splice ape DNA with human DNA to create stronger, faster, more resilient soldiers. Crazy guy. Alright, next up, Hirohito and Tojo in Japan. In the 1920s, Japan was moving towards democratic politics, which, for hundreds of years, Japan was not democratic. It had an emperor, it had a shogun, it had one person in full control. But in the 1920s, it was moving towards democracy. You have universal male suffrage. From 1925, you have Japan participating in modern and international culture. In 1928, though, you get something that goes against democracy. You get what's called the Peace Preservation Law, in which opponents of the empire were imprisoned or executed, meaning that if you went up to a police officer or if you held an assembly saying, the emperor is horrible, we should overthrow the government, you were executed or imprisoned. Today, that law does not really exist. If you were to go up to a police officer or a government official and say, down with the emperor, you would not necessarily get arrested, but you would get some pretty untoward looks. The Revolutionary Right, they assassinated public officials in 1936, attempting a coup d'etat, attempting an overthrow. After their overthrow was defeated, they were re-socialized instead of being executed or exiled, which doesn't really go with the peace preservation law, but hey, who knows. Now, after the Revolutionary Right, after the 1936 attempted coup, the Japanese military started gaining power. This is not helped by the fact that the current Emperor Hirohito wants to take a back seat on how the country is run, giving more and more power to the military. Now, the military starts to take power in business, politics, and media. And in that, I mean that in business, if you wanted to make a deal, two businessmen wanted to make a deal, it had to be approved by the military. Politics were generally military led, and media was censored by the military, meaning that things that went against the military or the government of Japan were taken out or refused to be seen. Hideki Tojo. Hideki Tojo is one of, if not the most important Japanese general during World War II. He was a general and statesman. He was actually even the prime minister of Japan from 1941 to 1944, and he would lead the Japanese military during the war. We will talk about Tojo a couple times throughout World War II, and you guys will learn quite a bit about why he is such a big name in history. Next up, Adolf Hitler. He founded the National Socialist or Nazi Party in 1920. This came from the German Workers' Party. He came through with a strong view on nationalism, meaning pride in one's country, racial superiority, specifically Aryans, opposition to communism, and a revival of Germany after the Great Depression. In 1923, he was arrested for treason, and while in jail, he wrote a book called Mein Kampf, or My Struggle, which was published and read and gained him a lot of support. This is what he viewed as the perfect person. You can see the blonde hair, you can see, well, you can't see it, but blonde eyes, tall. Generally, does this look like Hitler? No. Does this look like any of the reigning Nazi leaders? No. Why did they choose this though? Because of stereotypical German, Northern European views on beauty and genetic superiority. In 1933, he was legally installed as Chancellor of the Weimar Republic. He ran for president twice, and he lost both times. But the president, Hindenburg, the president of Germany, put Hitler in as a chancellor as a goodwill move towards people who supported the National Socialist Party and wanted to gain more strength. Once Hitler was installed as chancellor, all political parties other than the National Socialist or Nazi Party were outlawed. All the opponents were arrested, the media became controlled, and Germany was brought out of the Depression. These were all through Hitler as Chancellor. Now, Hitler also pulled out of the League of Nations and began building a military which went against the Treaty of Versailles. So did pulling out of the League of Nations. So people started seeing Hitler as a very negative individual. Now, as Chancellor, he eventually did merge the titles of President and Chancellor into a new word, Führer, which we'll talk about in a second. But Hitler did eventually become the leader of Germany, and while he was leading Germany, he started passing laws that discriminated against the Jewish people, which we will talk about in more depth later on. In 1934, you get what's called the Night of the Long Knives, which was extrajudicial or non-legal executions of political enemies. This was urged by two of Hitler's top men, Göring and Himmler. In 1936, you get the signing of Germany, Italy, and Japan in the Anti-Comintern Pact against communists. This pact would eventually become the Axis powers, as Germany, Italy, and Japan are the three main forces fighting against the Allied powers in World War II. In March of 1938, you get what's called Anschluss, which is German soldiers marching into Austria and annexing the country. Technically, there was a vote to be annexed that Austrians had, but the vote was in German, and the cards were very, very misleading on how the vote was going to go. They were very, very forceful of how they wanted the vote to go. In 1938, you get what's called the Munich Agreement, which is appeasement of Hitler by Great Britain, France, and Italy, giving up part of Czechoslovakia. Now, this is really important because Great Britain, France, and Italy thought that by appeasing Hitler, they could basically make him quiet. They could make it so that he would not want to spread out anymore. So you have Neville Chamberlain saying, yeah, we will give you part of Czechoslovakia as long as you promise not to take the rest and promise not to kind of continue on this warpath. Within a year, Hitler had annexed all of Czechoslovakia. In 1938, you get what's called Kristallnacht, which Nazis are vandalizing and looting Jewish businesses. In 1939, you get the German-Soviet Non-Aggression Pact, meaning that the Germans and the Soviet Union would not fight each other. Now, this becomes important within a couple months and within a couple, well, we'll talk about it next week, but you will see why this German-Soviet Non-Aggression Pact is so important very, very soon. Hitler became seen as a mystical leader, or Führer, and he would not be the end. This would not be the end of Nazi occultism. Nazis were very into the occult. You might have seen movies or video games that kind of allude to this. But in history, there are lots of accounts of Hitler seeking out certain religious objects. There are certain Nazi scientists that believed in werewolves and vampires and all sorts of other miscellaneous magical or mystical or mythical beings. I encourage you guys to kind of look into it because it is relatively interesting to see how this otherwise very regimented and organized group kind of gave into magic. All right, so this is just a map of Germany this is the map of Germany 1933 to 1949, and this is the spread of Hitler's Germany, of Nazi Germany all throughout. And you can see that it starts to spread and spread, basically going back to the size of Germany pre-World War I, which is really kind of nerve-wracking for most of Europe. Now, Hitler was seen as the top official. Hitler was seen as really the end-all be-all for German prosperity, leadership, all these sorts of things. But one thing to remember is that he was a person, and he took some embarrassing photographs, including this one. There's a whole series of photographs of Hitler in these weird shorts where he's just posing in shorts and stockings, and it's very, very strange. And once these photos kind of came out and he was a leader, he did do his best to remove them from public circulation. But those who opposed Hitler made sure to keep them in the cycle. Sorry to interrupt this video, but if you've stuck around this long and are continuing to watch, then I have good news for you. You have the opportunity to earn some extra credit. On the quiz, which will be posted along with this video, for question 5, in which you are asked to type in your response instead of typing in the answer, if you type in the name Joe Exotic, Joeexotic, Joe Exotic, I will give you extra credit on this quiz. Next up, you have Neville Chamberlain and Winston Churchill. Chamberlain was the British Prime Minister from 1937 to 1940, and he gave in to many of Hitler's demands during the Munich Agreement, again, in hopes of creating a peace. He returned to Britain to build up his military just in case. Just in case something were to happen, he wanted to make sure that there was a military, because people viewed Hitler as a threat, but thought that by appeasing him, they would end the threat. But you had to have just-in-case principles. Now, in this picture, you can see Chamberlain all the way over here. You can see Hitler, and that is Benito Mussolini. Now, after war is declared, after World War II really gets started, Neville Chamberlain resigns. And who takes his place? None other than Winston Churchill, who became British Prime Minister from 1940 to 1945. He was an advocate for British rearmament, or the British creating more weapons, building up an army, building up a navy, getting ready for war. He also pioneered the Lend-Lease Act with the Americans, which would supply Britain with supplies during the war, similar to how the U.S. supplied Britain with weapons during World War I. Speaking of Americans, you have Franklin Roosevelt and Harry S. Truman. Roosevelt was the 32nd U.S. president from 1933 to 1945, and as early as 1937, he was warning the Americans about the Axis powers, warning Americans that Germany, Italy, and Japan were not good for the world, that something needed to happen. Sure enough, 2 years later, World War II starts in Europe. Roosevelt wanted to intervene. He wanted to abandon what are called isolationist policies, and similar to Churchill, he was instrumental in the Lend-Lease Act. Now, Harry Truman was the 33rd U.S. president from 1945 to 1953. He supported many of FDR's new programs as a senator, and he was chosen as FDR's running mate in 1944, meaning that he would be vice president from 45 to 48. Despite being moderate and seen as a compromise, a lot of people really didn't like Truman. They thought that he was just kind of in the middle of everything. He was kind of like, if you go to a restaurant and you ask if they have Coca-Cola and they say they have Pepsi, that's Truman. He is the Pepsi of politicians. Now, even though Truman was the Pepsi of politicians, he would be the one to ultimately end World War II with American victory. So he's not all bad. Joseph Stalin. Joseph Stalin was a supporter of Lenin during the Russian Revolution, and he used his power as Secretary General of the Central Committee of the Communist Party to put allies in positions of power so that when Lenin died, he was able to have himself voted as the leader. Stalin was famous for what are called 5-year plans, taking Russia from a peasant economy to an industrial economy. He had millions of opponents to this idea, and more or less he had them shot or exiled, sent to gulags, and these people being shot, exiled, in addition to the weather patterns of Russia, resulted in the famine that caused the deaths of millions. This is followed by the Great Purge. The Great Purge, Stalin was notoriously paranoid. He constantly thought the people were out to get him. He thought they were going to try and trick him or basically overthrow him. And he expanded what he had as a secret police force. He encouraged citizens to spy on one another. And the guilty were either shot or sent to gulags, which were forced labor camps out in the middle of nowhere where people pretty much worked till they died. Now, Stalin was also famous for his propaganda. He had cities renamed after himself. He had history books rewritten about himself, basically making himself a more prominent figure within the Russian Revolution. He had artwork changed. He had literature changed. He even changed the national anthem to be more pro-him. A lot of pictures of Stalin have actually been retouched as far as they could be in the 1930s, 1940s to make himself look better. Basically, a very early version of Snapchat filters or Instagram filters or anything like that. He wanted to make sure that he looked good. Lastly, we have Francisco Franco. He was aided by the Nazis and the Italian army in the Spanish Civil War, which lasted from 1936 to 1939. And they put this as a fight between nationalists and communists, with the nationalists winning. When Franco won, he put Spain under authoritarian control, persecuting opponents, censoring the media, and creating a militant police force, executing tens of thousands of people. Although Spain, when World War II broke out, was officially neutral, he continued to send supplies and soldiers to Germany. He died in 1975. His protege, the person that he was mentoring and grooming to be the next dictator of Spain, as soon as Franco died and power shifted, his protege said, nope, we're not going to have this authoritarian regime anymore. We're going to vote, and Spain became a democracy in 1975. So, those were a very quick introduction to the leaders of World War II. Next week, we're going to get more into the nitty gritty, more into the actual aspects of World War II, what caused it, what happened during all this sort of thing. And I'd like you guys to answer, actually, you don't have to answer this question.